He split my lip, blackened my eye, and walked upstairs like he owned the world. So the next morning I set the most beautiful table of my life and invited everyone he feared most to sit down with him. If this story speaks to your soul, please subscribe to this channel and follow along with me until the very last word. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far my story has traveled. The blood in my mouth tasted like copper and shame. I sat on the cold bathroom floor, my back pressed against the cabinet beneath the sink, knees pulled tight to my chest, listening to the sound of Daniel's footsteps moving down the hallway above me. Heavy, unhurried, like a man who had done nothing wrong, like a man who had just watched the evening news and poured himself a glass of water before bed. Not like a man who had just thrown his wife into the edge of a dining room table hard enough to split her lip and leave a bruise the size of a fist spreading across her cheekbone. I pressed a folded washcloth to my mouth and stared at the grout lines between the bathroom tiles. I had counted them before during other nights like this one. 47 tiles from the door to the far wall. I knew that number, the way I knew the sound of his belt coming off, the way I knew the particular silence that followed his third drink, the way I knew which floorboard creaked outside our bedroom when he was coming back. I had learned to count things when the pain got loud. It gave my mind somewhere else to go. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, I wasn't counting to escape. I was counting to stay. Stay present, stay conscious, stay here in this moment with this washcloth and this bruise and this blood, because I needed to feel all of it, every single bit of it. I needed to stop running away inside my own head and actually sit with what was happening to me, what had been happening to me for 18 years. 18 years. I said it out loud alone in that bathroom just to hear how it sounded. 18 years. My voice came out rough and strange, like something I hadn't used in a long time. And maybe I hadn't. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. I had talked, plenty. Answered his questions, laughed when he told me to laugh, apologized when there was nothing to apologize for. But I hadn't spoken in my own voice in so long that the sound of it startled me. I lowered the washcloth and looked at it, the red blooms spreading across the white cotton. And I thought, Emily, this is your blood. This is your face. This is your life. And then for the first time in longer than I could remember, I thought, what are you going to do about it? I want to back up because I need you to understand how we got here. Not just to tonight, not just to the dining room table and Daniel's hand and the sound of my body hitting wood, but all the way back. Back to who I was before I became the woman sitting on that bathroom floor, counting tiles, swallowing blood. My name is Emily Thompson. I am 52 years old. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, the second of 4 children, raised by a mother who made everything from scratch and a father who believed that a quiet home was a happy home. We weren't wealthy, but we were warm. My mother used to say that a well-set table was a form of love, and she meant it. Sunday mornings in our house smelled like biscuits and coffee, and we all sat together without anyone raising their voice or throwing anything or making anyone feel small. I thought that was just how families worked. I thought I understood what love looked like. I met Daniel Thompson at 24 at a church social in Charleston, 2 years after I'd moved there for work. He was 31, tall, broad-shouldered, with a laugh that filled whatever room he walked into. He brought me flowers on our second date. He opened car doors. He called my mother ma'am, and meant it. He made me feel like the most important person in the room in a way I had never felt before and haven't felt since. And when he asked me to marry him on the steps of that same church 14 months after we met, I said yes before he even finished the question. Everybody loved Daniel Thompson. That's the part I need you to hold on to because it matters. It matters because when you love someone that the whole world loves, when you marry a man who your friends envy and your family adores, when the abuse starts, and it always starts quietly, so quietly you almost miss it, you have nowhere to turn. Because who would believe you? He's Daniel. He coaches Little League. He's on the church council. He brings casseroles to sick neighbors. Who is going to believe that Daniel Thompson, of all people, hits his wife? The first time he hit me, we had been married for 4 years. We argued about money. I can't even remember the details now, something about a credit card bill. and the argument escalated the way arguments do when you're tired and scared and too proud to back down. I said something sharp. I don't even remember what. And then his hand came across my face, and the world went sideways. I stood there, stunned, my hand against my cheek, looking at him. And he looked at me, and his face crumpled. He started crying before I did. He got down on his knees right there in the kitchen, and he grabbed my hands, and he said, "Emily, I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. I would never. God, I am so sorry." He was shaking. I had never seen him shake like that. And I believed him. I believed him because he believed himself. That's the thing about men like Daniel. In those early years, they're not performing remorse. They genuinely feel it. They hate themselves briefly and sincerely, and that hatred pours out onto you like a confession, and you absorb it, and you forgive it because the man in front of you crying looks like the man you married. And you love that man. You have built a life with that man, and you are 32 years old with a mortgage and a dog and a shared checking account, and the idea that your life is not what you thought it was. That possibility is so enormous and so terrifying that you simply choose not to look at it. So I didn't look. Not at 32, not at 35 when it happened again after a work party where he thought I'd smiled at a colleague too long. Not at 39 when our son Marcus was 9 years old and woke up to the sound of his parents and came downstairs to find me sitting on the kitchen floor and Daniel standing over me, and Daniel told him, calm as morning, "Mama just had a little fall, buddy. Go on back to bed." And Marcus looked at me with those big brown eyes, and I smiled at him and I said, "It's okay, baby. Go back to sleep." And he did, because I told him to, because I smiled, because I had gotten so good at the smile, at the reassuring voice, at the story that kept the world from seeing what was happening inside our house. I became an expert at concealment, foundation and concealer for the bruises, long sleeves in summer, sunglasses at church, excuses so well practiced they came out smooth and automatic. I walked into a door, I tripped on the stairs. I'm just clumsy. Always have been, you know how I am. I got so good at the lies that sometimes I half believe them myself. But your body keeps the score even when your mind refuses to. I started waking up at 3 in the morning with my heart hammering for no reason. I stopped eating properly, lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. I started flinching at loud sounds, a car backfiring a door, slamming in ways that embarrassed me in public. I became a smaller and smaller version of myself, shrinking into a shape that was easier for him to live around, easier for him not to hurt. The smaller I got, the bigger his anger got. Because that's how it works. That's what they never tell you in the movies and the Lifetime specials. They make it look like abuse is about power, and it is, it absolutely is, but it's also about escalation. Every time you absorb it, every time you forgive it, every time you smooth it over and set the table and put on the smile, you teach him that it works, that this is a strategy that gets results. And so the next time he needs a little more to feel the same level of control, a little louder, a little harder, a little more, and you adjust. You absorb the new level the way you learned to absorb the last one, and then he needs more again. By year 15, I was nothing like the woman who had said yes on those church steps, and Daniel was nothing like the man who had asked. He drank more now, steadily, methodically, the way some men go to the gym. His temper had gone from sudden storms to something more constant and low-grade, like weather that never fully cleared. He criticized everything: how I cooked, how I dressed, who I talked to, how I laughed. He had isolated me from most of my friends over the years, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually with enough plausible deniability that even I didn't see the full shape of it until it was done. This friend made him uncomfortable. That one was a bad influence. Why did I need to spend so much time with people outside the house when I had a family to take care of? My sister Lisa was the one person he never fully managed to cut out of my life, and I think it was because he knew somewhere in the back of his calculated mind that trying to separate me from Lisa would be a step too far. Lisa was a detective. She carried a badge and a firearm, and an expression that had a way of making dishonest people feel seen. Daniel was a deeply dishonest man, so he tolerated Lisa, but he watched me around her like a man watching someone near a window he didn't want opened. She knew. I knew she knew. We both knew she knew, but I had never let her in, never said the words out loud, never shown her the bruises or the hospital visits. I logged under other explanations. Because saying it to Lisa meant it was real in a way I still wasn't ready for. Saying it to Lisa meant doing something about it. And doing something about it meant my whole life, as broken as it was, would have to be dismantled and rebuilt. And I was terrified of the rubble. Last night was a Thursday. Marcus was at college now, sophomore year, University of Georgia, bless him. And the house was just the two of us, which was its own particular kind of hell. No buffer, no reason to maintain a performance for a child's sake. Just Daniel and me, and the enormous silence of a house that used to hold more people, more warmth, more life. He'd been drinking since early afternoon. I could tell by the time he came down for dinner, the way he walked, the particular glaze across his eyes, the way he sat down at the table without speaking and stared at his plate like it had personally offended him. I had made pot roast and vegetables a meal I had been making for 20-odd years. He'd always liked it, or he used to. "This is cold," he said without looking up. I touched the edge of my own plate. It wasn't cold. "I can heat it up for you," I said. "I said it's cold, Emily." "I'll put it back in the oven for a few minutes." I reached for his plate, and his hand came down on my wrist. Not striking, not yet, just gripping, tight enough to make a point. "I don't want you to fix it," he said slowly, like he was explaining something to someone not very bright. "I want you to hear me when I tell you something's wrong." "I hear you, Daniel." "Do you—" He let go of my wrist and leaned back in his chair, and there was something in his expression, that particular cold assessment, that made my stomach drop. "Because sometimes I don't think you do. I think you go through the motions. I think you put food on the table and nod your head and go through the motions, and you don't actually care." I said nothing. "You don't actually care about this marriage. You don't actually care about me." "That's not true," I said, but my voice was thin. "You're checked out." He picked up his glass. "You've been checked out for years, and you think I don't notice, but I notice everything. I always notice." He drank, set the glass down hard. "You know what your problem is. You've got too much going on in that head of yours. Too much other stuff. Too many opinions. You've forgotten how to just be a wife." I kept my eyes on my plate. He stood up. That's when I made my mistake. Not the first mistake of the evening, and not the worst one, but the one that changed everything. I looked up at him. I met his eyes, and I said quietly but clearly, "I'm tired, Daniel." He went very still. "I'm tired of this." The next few seconds happened very fast. He said something I don't even remember what the exact words, got swallowed by adrenaline, and then he moved around the table, and then his hand caught the side of my face with enough force to knock me sideways into the table's edge. I caught it with my cheekbone and my mouth, and I heard the crack of it more than I felt it at first. Then the pain came sharp and specific and humiliating. I straightened up. I looked at him. Blood was filling my mouth. And Daniel looked at me, and for just a moment, one single crystalline moment, there was no remorse on his face, no horror at what he'd done, no crying, no shaking, no falling to his knees. Just that cold calculation, already working out the aftermath, already deciding which version of the story was most useful. He turned and walked upstairs, and I stood at the dining room table, bleeding with the pot roast cooling in front of me, and I thought, oh, it's done now, not the marriage, not the abuse. Those had been done for years, if I was honest. What was done now, finally completely, irreversibly done, was me. My capacity to absorb, my willingness to shrink, my ability to pick up the pieces of this particular story one more time and rearrange them into something I could live with. I went to the bathroom. I closed the door. I sat down on the tile floor, and I counted 47 tiles one last time, and then I stopped counting and started thinking. I sat there for almost 2 hours. I thought about Marcus and the look on his face when he was 9 years old standing at the bottom of those stairs. I thought about how he was 19 now and in college, and he called me every Sunday, but there was always something held back in his voice, some question he didn't ask, something he'd seen and never said out loud. I thought about what it had cost him, all those years of pretending alongside me. I thought about my mother in Savannah, Her Sunday mornings, her perfectly set table, the way she believed that how you treat the people you share a table with is a reflection of your character. I thought about my sister Lisa and the way she looked at me, sometimes careful and watchful, like a woman waiting for a door to open. I thought about Pastor Jerome, who had counseled us twice early in the marriage when I'd tried briefly and obliquely to get help, without naming what needed to be helped. He had given Daniel the benefit of the doubt each time, the way good men sometimes do when they can't quite bring themselves to believe the worst of another man they respect. But he had also given me his personal number afterward and said, without quite saying it, "You call me Emily, anytime, day or night, you call me." I had never called. I thought about all of this sitting on the floor in the dark, and somewhere in the second hour, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with lightning and thunder, just a quiet, deep, cellular-level shift, like a bone setting back into place after years of being dislocated. A click, a rightness. I was done. Not done in the way I'd been done before, those small, private rebellions that never went anywhere, those moments of clarity that dissolved by morning. Done in the way that means action. Done in the way that requires a next step, and then another step, and then another. I got up off the floor. I washed my face carefully around the bruise. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time, and I want to tell you something about that moment. Something important. I did not look like a victim. I looked like a woman who had been waiting a very long time to make a decision and had finally made it. There was something in my eyes that I hadn't seen in years. I recognized myself. I went downstairs. The pot roast was cold. The dining table sat in the low light from the hallway, and I stood at it for a moment, and my mother's voice came to me as clearly as if she were standing in the room. "A well-set table is a form of love." Yes, I thought. Yes, it is. And I started to plan. Not frantically, not emotionally calmly. With the particular precision of a woman who has had 18 years of practice swallowing her feelings and managing logistics and keeping every piece of a complicated life in motion. I knew what I needed to do and who I needed to call. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew he would fight, it would cry, would apologize, would threaten, would use every tool in his considerable arsenal to stop what I was setting in motion. I didn't care. I went to the kitchen and got out my good china. The set my mother had given us for our wedding, which I almost never used because Daniel said it was too much trouble to hand wash. I set each piece carefully on the table one by one. Then I got out the embroidered tablecloth. Then the good glasses. Then I sat down at the dining room table in the middle of the night with my split lip and my bruised face, and I wrote 2 text messages and 1 phone call's worth of plans, and then I went to the kitchen and I started a list. Cheesy grits, scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, homemade biscuits, his favorite breakfast, the one he used to ask for on special occasions, the one my mother had taught me how to make hands in mine 25 years ago. I was going to make it one last time. Not for him, for me, for the ending, for the table my mother taught me to set, finally set the way it was always meant to be, with truth on it, and consequence, and the long overdue reckoning of a man who had for too long sat at it like he owned everything in the room, including me. I went to bed just before 3 in the morning. Daniel was already asleep, the particular deep sleep of men who feel no guilt about what they've done. I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe, and I felt for the first time in years completely, entirely calm. Tomorrow morning, everything was going to change, and I was the one who was going to change it. I was up before the sun. Not because I couldn't sleep, surprisingly, I had slept. 3 hours, maybe a little more, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion and absolute resolve. When my eyes opened at 5:47 in the morning, I lay still for exactly 30 seconds, staring at the ceiling, making sure the decision I had made in the dark was still there in the light. It was. Solid as concrete. Solid as the bruise already darkening across my cheekbone. I got up without making a sound. Daniel was still sleeping, one arm thrown across my side of the bed, the way he always slept, sprawled, taking up space even unconscious, claiming more than his share. I looked at him for a moment. Just looked. and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Nothing. Not love, not hate, not fear. Just a flat, clear, finished nothing, like standing in a room after all the furniture has been moved out. I went downstairs. The first thing I did was make coffee. Strong the way I actually liked it, not the weak half-pot Daniel always said was better for his stomach. I poured myself a full mug and stood at the kitchen counter and drank half of it before I did anything else, because I needed the heat and the bitterness and the simple act of doing something for myself before I did anything else. Then I picked up my phone. Lisa answered on the second ring. It was not quite 6 in the morning, but my sister answered on the second ring, and that single fact that she had been waiting all these years for exactly this call nearly broke me open right there in the kitchen. Emily. Her voice was awake, alert, like she'd been sitting by the phone. Lisa. My voice cracked on the one syllable of her name, and I pressed my lips together and breathed through my nose for a second before I kept going. I need you to come over this morning, early, before 8. A pause. Not a surprised pause, a careful one. Tell me what happened. He hit me. I heard her exhale sharp and controlled the exhale of a woman who was trained to manage her reactions, but who was also first and always my little sister. How bad? Split lip, bruise on my cheek. I'm okay. Emily. I'm okay, I said again, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant it in years. But I need you here. I need you in uniform, Lisa. Can you do that? Another pause. This one had a different quality. What are you planning? Breakfast, I said. I heard her laugh, a short, startled sound, half disbelief, half something that might have been admiration. I'll be there at 7:45. Thank you. Emily. Her voice dropped, all the detective stripped away. Just Lisa now, just my sister. I love you. We're going to get through this. I couldn't answer that. I just said goodbye and hung up before the tears could come, because I couldn't afford tears right now. Tears were for after. Tears were for later. Right now, I had biscuits to make. I called Pastor Jerome next. He answered on the third ring, his voice the low, unhurried rumble of a man who had been awake for an hour already, which I knew he had been, because Jerome was the kind of man who rose before dawn to pray, and I had always loved that about him, even when I resented the faith. He represented the faith I had prayed to and felt abandoned by through 18 years of closed doors. Emily Thompson, he said. The warmth in his voice when he said my name almost undid me. It's early. I know. I'm sorry to call like this. Don't you apologize to me. What do you need? I need you to come to my house this morning, 7:45, maybe 8. I need a witness, Jerome. I need someone who's known us, who's known Daniel, who can't be argued with. The silence on his end was long enough that I thought I might have lost him. Then he said quietly, I gave you my number years ago for a reason. I know. Are you safe right now? He's upstairs, sleeping. I'll be there. Jerome, I steadied my voice. He's going to try to make it complicated. He's going to perform. I need you to not let him perform. Emily, Pastor Jerome said, and his voice had something in it I can only describe as authority, the deep kind that doesn't need volume. I know exactly what Daniel Thompson is. I've known for longer than you think. I'll be there. I stood in the kitchen after that call and breathed for a full minute. 2 people. 2 witnesses. 2 people who loved me and could not be bought or frightened or charmed. That was the architecture of the morning. Not chaos, not screaming, not the kind of explosive confrontation that Daniel would know how to navigate. He was good in explosions. He was practiced in them. He knew how to escalate and dominate and make the other person look unstable, but he had no idea how to handle calm. I started on the biscuits. There is something almost meditative about making biscuits from scratch, about the way your hands work the dough fold and press the rhythm of it, pulling you down into a still place inside yourself. My mother's recipe: 2 cups of flour, tablespoon of baking powder, pinch of salt, Cold butter cut in until it looked like coarse sand, then buttermilk cold, always cold, worked in just until it comes together. You can't overwork biscuit dough. You have to be gentle with it, committed, but not rough, because too much pressure makes it tough. I had learned that in my mother's kitchen at 12 years old, and I had never forgotten it. I thought about the irony of that while my hands worked. Gentle, but committed. Not too much pressure. Be careful, or you'll ruin it. If only someone had told Daniel the same thing. The grits went on the stove next, slow and low, stirred constantly, the way you have to stir grits if you want them right. Then the bacon in the cast iron pan, the smell of it filling the downstairs, and I knew when the smell reached the second floor, he would start to wake up. Daniel had always been pulled from sleep by the smell of food, like a large domestic animal following its instincts. I had about 40 minutes. I set the table while the bacon crisped. My mother's china already out from the night before, the embroidered cloth, the good glasses. I folded the napkins the way she had taught me, sharp corners placed just so, and I stepped back and looked at it. And for a moment, I was 12 years old in Savannah, watching my mother's hands move over a Sunday table, and I had to close my eyes and breathe. Then I sat down at the head of the table. Not my usual seat, not the chair on the side, the chair I had occupied for 18 years of meals in this house, the chair that was just slightly smaller, just slightly removed from the center. I sat at the head, Daniel's seat. And I placed my coffee mug in front of me, and I sat up straight, and I tried the feeling on like a coat I wasn't sure would fit. It fit. It fit so well it scared me. I heard him upstairs at 7:20, the creak of the bathroom water running, the specific sound of his morning movements that I had memorized the way you memorize a language you live inside of. He was slower than usual, which meant the hangover was real, which meant his mood this morning would be either falsely bright, the charm offensive he deployed after bad nights, or still cold and entitled, depending on which version of himself he woke up as. I heard him on the stairs at 7:31. He stopped at the bottom. I didn't turn around. I sat at the head of that table with my coffee and my straight spine, and I waited, and the silence stretched out between us like a held breath. "Emily." His voice was careful, testing the air. "You're up early." "I am," I said. He came around into my eye line and stopped. I watched him take in the table, the china, the cloth, the full spread of breakfast, the biscuits golden in the pan, the grits in the good serving bowl, and I watched something flicker across his face that I recognized as surprise, and then beneath the surprise, something else, wariness, because Daniel Thompson knew me, and he knew that this was not a normal morning, and some animal part of him, the part that always knew when he'd gone too far, was already on alert. "This looks nice," he said slowly. "Sit down, Daniel." He pulled out the chair across from me, his usual chair, not the head seat, and sat down. He looked at the food, looked at me, looked at my face, and I watched the precise moment when he registered the bruise. His jaw tightened. That was all. No remorse, no apology, just the calculation already running. "Emily, about last night." "Have some coffee," I said. I poured it for him steady-handed and set it in front of him. He picked it up, drank, set it down. "I want to talk about last night." "We will," I said, "and we'll talk about everything. Just wait." "Wait for what?" The doorbell rang at exactly 7:49. I saw his face change. "Who is that?" I stood up. I walked to the front door with my shoulders back and my chin level and my bruised face exactly as it was, uncovered, undisguised, wearing every bit of what he had done to me the night before, like the evidence it was. I opened the door. Lisa was in uniform. Full detective's uniform badge, visible expression, composed in that particular way she had warm underneath iron on top. Behind her was Pastor Jerome in his dark jacket, his big hands folded in front of him, his face carrying the gravity of a man who had come to bear witness. Lisa looked at my face, and something moved behind her eyes, quick and fierce and controlled, and she touched my arm briefly just once, just her hand on my arm, and said nothing. "Come in," I said. We walked back to the dining room together, the three of us, and I will tell you that I have never felt less alone in my adult life than I did in that moment walking back to that table with my sister on one side and my pastor on the other, walking back toward the man who had spent 18 years making me feel like I had no one. Daniel was standing when we came back in. He had pushed back from the table and was on his feet, and his face had gone through several transformations in the 30 seconds I'd been gone, surprise, then calculation, then a visible attempt at composure that didn't quite hold. "Lisa," he said. He tried the smile. The social smile, the one that worked at church socials and neighborhood barbecues. "What a surprise. And Jerome, what's going on? Is everything all right?" Neither of them spoke. They waited. I walked to the head of the table. I stood behind my chair. I placed my hands on the back of it, and I looked at my husband across the table, and I said, "Sit down, Daniel." He didn't move. "Emily, what is this? What are you?" I said, "Sit down." My voice. My own voice, the one I'd heard in the bathroom at 3 a.m, the one I barely recognized anymore. It came out low and clear and final, and something in it made Daniel Thompson, a man who had spent years not being afraid of me, sit down. Lisa and Jerome took the chairs on either side. Nobody touched the food. Daniel looked around the table at the three of us, and I watched the charm dissolve. Not instantly, he tried. "Honey, I don't know what Lisa's told you, but—" "Lisa hasn't told me anything," I said. "I told her." He pivoted. "Jerome, I'm glad you're here because I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "Daniel!" Jerome's voice was not loud, but it landed in the room with the weight of a door closing. "I want you to stop talking and listen." Daniel closed his mouth, and I talked. I had been practicing this conversation for years in my head, and in my head, it always came out tangled, emotional, circular, easy to interrupt and deflect and reframe. But standing there at the head of that table, with Lisa on my right and Jerome on my left, and my mother's china laid out around us, and the bruise on my face doing its own silent testimony, it came out straight, clear, specific. I named dates. I named incidents. I described what he had done to me with my son, standing at the bottom of the stairs. I described the hospital visit I had disguised as a car accident. I described last night exactly, and without embellishment, every word that was said and every movement that was made. I watched his face while I talked. I watched him try on 3 or 4 different expressions: remorse, confusion, quiet, hurt, trying to find the one that would work, that would create enough doubt in the room to shift the dynamic. But here was what he hadn't counted on. Lisa had heard this before. Not the specific details, but the architecture of it, the shapes and patterns of it, because she was a detective who worked these cases, and she knew every move in his playbook, and she was not moved by any of it. And Jerome had known. He had told me as much on the phone. I didn't yet know how much he had known, or for how long. But the look on his face while I spoke was not the look of a man hearing something shocking. It was the look of a man who had been waiting years for this conversation and was relieved deeply and visibly relieved that it was finally happening. When I finished, Daniel said nothing for a long moment. Then he took a breath and leaned forward, and he said, his voice low and careful, "Emily, I know I've made mistakes. I know I have. And I am sorry for last night. I am truly sorry. But you are presenting a very one-sided— Daniel." Lisa spoke for the first time. Her voice was professional, uninflected, precise as a scalpel. "I want to remind you that you are speaking to a law enforcement officer and that anything you say right now—" "Lisa, come on, this is family. That is my sister's face," Lisa said. The table went quiet. Daniel looked at her. She looked back. "That," Lisa said slowly, "is my sister's face. I am looking at what you did to my sister's face. And I need you to understand that the only reason I am sitting here having this conversation instead of doing something else is because Emily asked me to sit here and have this conversation." She paused. "So I would choose your next words very carefully." He turned to Jerome. I could see the calculation, the pastor, the appeal to faith and forgiveness and mercy. "Jerome, you know me. You've known me for 20 years. You know that I am not a bad man. I have flaws, I have struggles, and I know I need to do better. Daniel, Pastor Jerome said quietly, I owe you an apology. Every person at the table went still. I owe Emily an apology, Jerome continued, and I owe you one too in a different way. When you both came to me in the early years, I saw it. Not all of it, but enough. And I prayed on it, and I told myself that marriage was a covenant, and that patience and faith could heal what was broken. And I was wrong. He looked at Daniel steadily. I was wrong to let my beliefs about marriage become a reason to leave Emily in harm's way. I have carried that for a long time. And I am here today because I will not make that mistake again. Daniel's face had gone a color I had never seen on him before. Not red, not the hot red of his anger. Something paler, something that looked for the first time in years like genuine reckoning. He looked at me, and I looked back at him calm and clear and unhurried, and I thought, I see you. I finally completely see you, and you have no more power over me than I decide to give you. Emily, he said, and his voice was different, something stripped out of it. What do you want? I want this to be over, I said. I want to stop surviving my own life. And I want you to understand that what you've done, all of it, not just last night, all of it has consequences. Real ones. That don't go away because you apologize or cry or promise to do better. I held his gaze. I have documented everything, Daniel. Dates, times, photographs, medical records. I have had help I never told you about. And today is not the beginning of a conversation. Today is the end of one. He opened his mouth. The front door opened. I hadn't told Daniel about the third call I had made the night before. The one after Lisa and after Jerome, the one I had placed at 2:15 in the morning, to a number I had kept in the back of a journal, hidden under a loose floorboard in the closet for 3 years, waiting for the night I would finally need it. The officer who walked in was not one I knew. Young, measured professional. He nodded to Lisa, who had briefed him outside. He looked at Daniel with no particular feeling. Mr. Thompson? Daniel stood up so fast his chair scraped back. Daniel. My voice was the steadiest thing in the room. Don't. He looked at me, and in that look was everything, the rage and the shame and the love that had curdled and the fear that had finally found the right person to land on. All of it in one look. And then something in him simply gave way. I watched it happen, watched his shoulders drop, watched him press his hand to his mouth, watched 20 years of careful constructed identity collapse in a man who had never once believed this morning was coming. Emily, he said, just my name, like a question. I know, I said, and I sat back down at the head of the table, and I picked up my coffee, and I let the morning do what it had always been going to do. They put handcuffs on Daniel Thompson at 8:23 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was looking at the clock on the kitchen wall when it happened, the same clock that had hung there for 14 years, the one with the rooster on the face that I had always hated and had never replaced because Daniel said it was fine, and I had learned to stop wanting things that Daniel said were fine. I was looking at that clock, and then I was looking at my husband's wrists, and then the sound the cuffs made, that small definitive click went through me like a tuning fork. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because there is a version of this story where the wife cries when they take her husband away, where the years of love and loss and grief all collapse into that one moment, and maybe that is the more sympathetic version, the one that makes me easier to understand. But I did not cry. What I felt was closer to the feeling you get when a headache you have had so long you forgot it was a headache finally lifts. Not joy, not triumph. Just the sudden, astonishing absence of pain. Lisa stood beside me on the front porch as they walked him to the patrol car. She didn't put her arm around me or say anything. She just stood there, solid and present, and that was exactly right. That was exactly what I needed. Daniel turned once at the car door. He looked back at the house, and for a moment I thought he was looking at me, but he wasn't. He was looking at the house itself, The brick, the windows, the front door he had walked through 10,000 times. He was looking at it the way people look at things they suddenly understand they are losing. And then the officer put a hand on his head, guiding him into the back seat, and the door closed, and the car moved down the street, and he was gone. Pastor Jerome came to stand on my other side. The three of us stood there on the porch, watching the empty street. "You should eat," Jerome said finally. "All that food's gonna go cold." I laughed. It surprised me the laugh came up from somewhere low and genuine, and startled me with its realness. "Jerome, you have been through a woman's most significant morning, and your first thought is breakfast." "The Lord provides," he said completely seriously, and Lisa made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and I reached over and squeezed her hand. We went back inside. The three of us sat at that table, and we ate. The biscuits were still warm. The grits were thick and cheesy and exactly right. The bacon was crisp. I had made this same breakfast for 20 years, but I tasted it differently that morning, actually tasted it the way you taste food, when you are finally fully inside your own body, instead of floating somewhere above it, managing and monitoring and calculating the safest version of yourself. Lisa ate 2 biscuits without speaking. She did that when she was processing something went quiet and methodical, like a machine cycling through data. I knew her well enough to let her do it. Jerome said grace first, which under normal circumstances would have made me impatient, but that morning I bowed my head and meant it. Or not meant the words exactly, but meant the pause, meant the recognition that this moment deserved to be marked as something. It was Lisa who spoke first, when the plates were half empty and the coffee had been refilled. She set down her fork and looked at me and said, "Tell me about the journal." I looked up. "You said you had documentation. Dates, photographs, medical records." She was in detective mode now, careful and direct. "I need to know what you have." "It's upstairs. There's a loose board under the closet floor on my side of the room." I watched her face carefully. 3 years' worth. I started after the hospital visit, the one I told the ER was a car accident. The doctor, I think she knew. She wrote something on the discharge papers, very carefully worded, and she gave me a card. I paused. "I kept it all." Lisa was quiet for a moment. "Emily, why didn't you—" She stopped, started again. "You had this documentation for 3 years, and you—" "I wasn't ready," I said. "I knew I wasn't ready, and I knew that if I started it before I was ready, he would find a way to stop it. He would apologize and perform and charm his way through it, and I would believe him, and then the documentation would just be evidence that I had been planning something, and he would use it against me." I set my coffee down. I needed to wait until I was completely irreversibly done, so that nothing he did or said in that moment could reach me. Lisa stared at me for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly. "You have been the most methodically patient person. I learn from the best," I said, and I nodded at her badge. She laughed, short and surprised, and then her face went serious again. "This is going to be complicated, Emily. I need you to understand that. He will have a lawyer, a good one, and the lawyer will look at everything, the documented incidents, the timing, whether anything can be challenged." "I know. And there will be people who—" "I know, Lisa." She looked at me. "You've thought this through." "I've had 3 years," I said. "I've thought through every single version." Jerome, who had been listening with his hands folded around his coffee cup, said quietly, "What do you need right now, Emily, today? This morning. Not the legal process that will move the way it moves. What do you need right now?" I opened my mouth and then closed it, because the question caught me off guard. Not the practical version of it. I had a list. I had plans. I had people to call and accounts to separate and locks to change. But the real version of it, the version Jerome was asking, that one, I didn't have an automatic answer for. What did I need right now? "I need to call Marcus," I said, and my voice, which had been steady through all of it, finally cracked. "I need to call my son before he hears this from someone else." Lisa reached across the table and put her hand over mine. I called Marcus at 9:15. He answered on the first ring, which meant he was already awake already, in that young person at college state of being technically conscious, but not yet fully human. "Hey, Mom." His voice was warm and unhurried. "Everything okay? You don't usually call on Fridays." I had planned what I was going to say. I had rehearsed it in the way I had rehearsed everything about this morning. But when I heard my son's voice, 19 years old and trusting and warm, all my prepared words dissolved. "Marcus," I said, "baby, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything. Can you do that for me?" A pause. His voice shifted, the warmth still there, but something underneath it sharpening. "Mom, you're scaring me." "You're scaring." "I know, I'm sorry, just listen." And I told him. Not everything, not the full 18 years, not the dates and incidents and hospital visits, but the truth of it, the shape of it, that his father had hurt me, that it had been happening for a long time, that this morning I had done something about it, and his father was gone, and I was okay. The silence on his end lasted long enough that I said, "Marcus, I knew." His voice came out raw, just 2 words, raw and low and cracked right down the middle. "Mom, I knew. I've known since I was 9 years old. I've been waiting." He stopped. I heard him breathe. "I've been waiting for you to call me and tell me he did something bad enough that you had to leave." I put my hand over my mouth. "I should have said something," he said. "I should have... Stop." My voice came out firm through the tears that were finally coming. "Marcus, listen to me. You were a child. You are still my child. None of this was yours to carry. Do you hear me? None of it. That weight was never supposed to be on you." "Mom, I'm telling you that now so you don't spend the next 10 years blaming yourself, because I know you and I know you will, and I won't have it." I wiped my face. I handled it wrong for a long time. That's on me, but I handled it right this morning. And I am okay. I am more okay than I've been in years. He was crying. I could hear it, the particular sound of a young man trying not to cry and not succeeding, and it broke my heart into pieces and put it back together at the same time. "Can I come home?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Come home, baby." After I hung up, I sat at the table for a long time by myself. Lisa had gone upstairs to retrieve the journal and the records carefully, officially, the way a detective retrieves evidence. Jerome had stepped outside to make some calls of his own, and I sat alone at my good china and my embroidered tablecloth, and I let the tears come. All of them, the ones I had been holding back since the bathroom floor last night, since 3 years ago, since 18 years ago, since the first time his hand found my face, and I decided to pretend it hadn't. I cried for a long time, not prettily, not quietly, the kind of crying that is really more like releasing pressure, like something structural finally giving way. And when it was over, I felt hollowed out and clean. Lisa came back downstairs with the journal and a folder of documents and a look on her face that I couldn't immediately read. She sat down across from me. She set everything on the table carefully. "Emily," she said, "there's something in here I didn't expect." I looked at her. "The medical records from the hospital, the car accident." She opened the folder and slid a paper toward me. "The doctor who treated you. She didn't just give you a card." I looked at the paper. It took me a moment to understand what I was reading and then another moment to absorb it. The doctor had filed a report 3 years ago. She had filed it carefully with enough professional documentation to be credible and enough discretion not to trigger an immediate response that I might have been pressured to deny. She had filed it and flagged it and then waited the way people in her position sometimes have to wait for the person at the center of it to be ready to corroborate it. She had been waiting 3 years for me. I didn't even know her name well enough to remember it, and she had been holding a door open for me for 3 years just in case. "There's more," Lisa said. I looked up. 2 of your neighbors filed noise complaints over the past 4 years. Both noted, and this is the word they used, both of them independently, they noted that the disturbances always stopped suddenly, and that you always appeared the next day looking different. One of them, the woman on the left, Mrs. Carver, Lisa's voice was controlled, but only just. She kept a log, written dated, in a notebook. She gave it to the responding officer each time, and was told there was nothing to be done without a formal complaint. I thought of Patricia Carver. 71 years old widowed, who brought me tomatoes from her garden every summer and always looked at me with her head slightly tilted, slightly too long, the look I had always interpreted as nosiness, but now understood differently. She had been watching over me with the only tools she had, a pen and a notebook and a faith that someday someone would listen. "I need to go see her," I said. "Not today," Lisa said. "Today you rest. Today you eat and you rest and you let the process start." Her eyes were serious. "Emily, what you have here, the documentation, the medical records, the neighbor's log, this is not a weak case. This is a strong case. I need you to understand that." I nodded. "He is going to fight this," she said. "You need to be prepared for the version of Daniel that comes out on the other side of this morning. The remorseful version, the victim version, the man who has a drinking problem and needs help version. He has used all of those before, and they have worked before. He is going to try them again." "I know who he is," I said. "I know you do. But knowing and feeling it in your body when he's doing it are two different things, and I need you to have support around you. Not just me. Therapy, Emily. Real therapy." I almost said I didn't need it, because that was the reflex, the 18-year-old reflex of minimizing, of insisting I was fine, of not wanting to be a burden. I caught the reflex and I let it pass. "Okay," I said instead. Lisa blinked like she'd expected a fight. "Okay. Yes," I said. "Okay, I'll go." I picked up my coffee. "Don't look so surprised." She smiled, and the smile turned into something that trembled at the edges, and she pressed her lips together. "I've been waiting for this morning for so long, Emily." "I know. I kept thinking—" She stopped, started again. "I kept thinking if I pushed too hard he'd find a way to use it, use my involvement to isolate you further, and I was scared that if I pushed and you pulled back I'd lose you altogether. So I kept the door open and I waited." "I know," I said again. "I knew you were waiting. That's why I could always come back." She reached across the table and gripped my hand, and neither of us said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. Jerome came back inside at a little past 10. He set his coat on the chair, sat down, and poured himself another cup of coffee with the ease of a man who has always known he was welcome in this house, which I realized I wanted him to be, genuinely wanted him to be. "I called the associate pastor," he said, "and I called Margaret Walsh." He looked at me carefully. "She runs the women's support group at the church, the one I've been suggesting you've been suggesting for 5 years. I finished. She's expecting your call," he said simply. "When you're ready, no pressure. This week, next month, she will be there." I thought of Margaret Walsh, a small still woman in her 60s, who sat in the third pew every Sunday, and who had survived, I had heard in fragments over the years, something significant. I had never allowed myself to know the details. Now I thought I understood why knowing the details had felt too dangerous. "I'll call her," I said. Jerome nodded. He wrapped his hands around his mug, and then after a moment he said the thing I hadn't expected him to say. "Emily, what Daniel did, the abuse, all of it, I want to say something about the church's role in this, and I want to say it plainly." I looked at him. "The message you received in this community and elsewhere that a good wife endures, that marriage is a covenant that supersedes your safety, that forgiveness means staying, that message is wrong. It has always been wrong, and I am deeply sorry that you absorbed it, and that I in any way contributed to it." His voice was steady and clear. "Your God is not a God who requires you to bleed on the altar of someone else's violence. Whatever you were told explicitly or implicitly, I need you to hear me say that clearly." The room was quiet. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it in the deepest possible way. My phone rang at 10:47. I looked at the screen, a number I didn't recognize but with a local area code. I answered it because this was a morning for answering things, for not looking away. "Mrs. Thompson," the voice was professional female clipped. "This is Diane Holloway from Holloway Family Law. I was referred to you by Detective Lisa Hartwell. I understand you may need representation." I looked at Lisa across the table. She was looking at her own coffee carefully with an expression of complete innocence. "How long ago did she refer me?" I asked. There was a brief pause. About 2 years ago, actually. She asked me to keep your information on file in case you ever called. I closed my eyes for a moment. 2 years. Lisa had been 2 years ahead of me, quietly building a net for me to fall into when I finally let go. She had done it without telling me, without pressuring me, without making me feel surveilled or pushed. She had just prepared, loved me in the most practical, useful, invisible way she knew how. "Mrs. Thompson," Diane Holloway said, "would you like to schedule a consultation?" "Yes," I said. "I would." When I hung up, I looked at my sister. She was still studying her coffee with that same elaborate innocence. 2 years, Lisa. "The grits are getting cold," she said. "Lisa Marie Hartwell." She looked up, and her eyes were bright with something she was barely managing to hold back. "You're my sister," she said simply. "What else was I supposed to do?" I shook my head. I was laughing and I was crying, and the two things were so mixed together I couldn't tell them apart. And the biscuits were cold and the grits were congealing, and Daniel was in a holding cell somewhere, and my son was driving home from Athens, Georgia, and Patricia Carver next door had been keeping a notebook for 4 years, and a doctor I barely remembered had held a report open for 3. All these people, all this invisible love arranged around me in the dark, waiting. I had never been as alone as he wanted me to believe. That was the thing that undid me sitting at that table, in the wreckage and the strange new lightness of that morning. Not the violence, not the years, not the fear I had processed those already, or had begun to. What undid me was the realization of how many people had been loving me quietly and faithfully, while I believed I was completely, utterly alone. I had thought the table I set that morning was my act of power. But the real table had been set for years by hands I hadn't seen, by people who had kept a seat warm for me, waiting for the morning I finally came to sit in it. I picked up my fork. I finished my breakfast. Marcus arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon. I heard his car before I saw him, that particular rattle in the exhaust that he kept promising to fix, and never did the sound of it coming down the street, hitting me somewhere in the chest before he even pulled into the driveway. I was at the kitchen sink when I heard it, and I set down the glass I was holding, and I walked to the front door, and I opened it before he even got to the porch steps. He was taller than I remembered. That happens with your children. They go away for months and come back, and something has shifted. Some degree of angle in the shoulders, some new weight in the way they carry themselves. Marcus was 19 and broad-shouldered like his father, which had always been a complicated thing for me to look at. But today, I looked at my son's face, and I saw myself, my eyes, my mother's jaw. The specific expression of someone who has been holding something too long and has finally gotten permission to put it down. He took one look at my face, the bruise, the split lips still visible, despite the hours that had passed, and he stopped on the second porch step. "Mom." His voice broke on the word. "Come here," I said. He crossed the distance in 2 steps, and I pulled him into me, and he bent down. He had 4 inches on me. Now had for 2 years, a fact that still mildly astonished me, and he held on the way he hadn't held on since he was small. I felt him shaking. Not crying exactly, more like the shaking that comes before crying, the shaking of someone who has been braced for a long time and is finally structurally letting go. "I should have done something," he said into my shoulder. "Mom, I knew, and I should have. Marcus." I pulled back enough to look at him, both hands on his face, and I said it clearly and directly because I meant every word. "You were a child, living in a house with a dangerous man. Your job was to survive it and get out, and you did both of those things. You are not responsible for what he did to me. Do you understand that?" He looked at me with wet eyes and pressed his lips together. "Say you understand it," I said. "I understand it," he said, and then quieter. "I don't fully believe it yet." "That's okay," I said. "That's what the therapist is for." He blinked. "You're going to therapy." "We both are," I said. "Non-negotiable." So something shifted in his face, surprise, and then something that looked like relief, so profound it almost looked like pain, like a door opening in a room that had been sealed for years. He had been waiting, I realized, for me to be the kind of mother who asked for help, who modeled asking for help, who didn't insist that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I had been so focused on protecting him from the truth that I had never considered whether the lie was also a kind of damage. "Come inside," I said. "I saved you biscuits." He ate 4 of them at the kitchen table while I sat across from him, and we talked in the particular way that people talk when they are trying to cover years of unsaid things in an afternoon. He told me about the nights at college when he would lie awake wondering if he should call, the times he had almost called Lisa, the time sophomore year of high school when he had looked up domestic violence resources on his phone in his bedroom and then deleted the browser history because he was afraid his father would check. That one hit me like a physical thing. My 15-year-old son alone in his room looking up how to help his mother and then hiding the evidence. Carrying that weight through high school, through college applications, through every milestone of his young life. "Marcus," I said, "I am so sorry." "Don't," he said. "Don't apologize to me, Mom. He's the one who—" "I'm not apologizing for what he did," I said. "I'm apologizing for waiting so long to stop it. Those are 2 different things, and I own my part of it." I looked at my son steadily. I was afraid. For a long time I was afraid, and the fear made me make choices that cost you things. I can't give those back, but I can tell you the truth about them, and I can make sure the next part of your life doesn't carry the same weight. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What happens now with him?" "There will be a hearing. His lawyer will file motions. It will take time, and it will not be simple." I said it plainly the way Diane Holloway had said it to me on the phone. He will try to tell a different version of the story. He has been telling a different version for 18 years, and a lot of people have believed it. Some of them will keep believing it. "His friends from church," Marcus said. Flat, like he had already anticipated this. "Probably." "What about Coach Briggs?" He named Daniel's oldest friend, a man who had been at our house for dinner every other month for 2 decades. "He's not going to—" "I don't know," I said honestly. "And I can't control it. What I can control is the evidence, and the evidence is solid." Marcus turned his mug in his hands. "Did he call you after they did he try to reach you?" I glanced at my phone on the counter. "He's been processed. He can't contact me directly." I paused. "But Diane, my lawyer, she said his attorney already called her this afternoon." Marcus's head came up. "Already?" "He had the number ready," I said, "which tells you something." The number had been ready. That detail had landed on me around noon when Diane Holloway called back to tell me that opposing counsel had made contact. Daniel had a lawyer's number ready to go, not a number he'd had to look up, not a call he'd had to ask someone to help him make. Ready, waiting. Like he had always known on some level that this morning was a possibility, like he had been carrying his own contingency plan. I thought about what that meant, that he had been afraid of me on some level even while he hurt me, that some part of him had always known the ground beneath his behavior was not as solid as he performed it to be. And I thought about how much energy it must have taken over 18 years to be that afraid of consequences while doing everything possible to eliminate the person who might cause them. What a way to live! What an exhausting, hollow, ultimately failed way to live. Marcus stayed through dinner. We ordered pizza because neither of us had the energy to cook, and we sat on the living room floor eating it because the dining table still felt charged with the morning's events, like a place where something significant had happened and the air hadn't settled yet. We watched a movie, something light, neither of us tracking it much, and by 9 o'clock, Marcus was asleep on the couch, long legs hanging over the armrest, and I sat in the armchair watching him breathe and thinking, this is mine. This person, this young man who is trying to be good in a world that showed him early how hard that is. He is mine, and he is okay, and we are going to be okay. The call came at 11:43 that night. I was in bed, not sleeping, staring at the ceiling in the dark. My phone lit up on the nightstand, and the number was one I recognized, Daniel's brother Kevin calling from Memphis. I stared at it for 4 rings before I answered. "Emily." Kevin's voice was careful the way all the voices around Daniel had been careful today. "I heard what happened." "Then you know more than I expected," I said. "Daniel called me from the station, before the process went through." A pause. He asked me to call you. Did he? He wanted me to ask you to think about whether this is really, he wanted me to tell you that he knows he needs help, that he's willing to get help, that if you just give him the chance. Kevin, I kept my voice level. Did he tell you what he did to my face? Silence. Did he tell you what he did the time before that, or the time before that? Did he tell you about the hospital? Did he tell you about your nephew standing at the bottom of the stairs at 9 years old, watching his mother on the kitchen floor? The silence on Kevin's end was long and different now, not the silence of careful phrasing, but the silence of a man genuinely confronted with something he had not known or had not let himself know. Emily, he said, and his voice had changed, rougher. I didn't know it was like that. Most people didn't, I said. He's very good. Another silence. I'm sorry I called. Don't be, I said. I'm glad you did. Because now you know. And what you do with that is your business. But I wanted at least one person in his family to have heard it from me directly. I paused. Good night, Kevin. I hung up. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. I recognized the distinction now between fear shaking and adrenaline shaking. This was adrenaline. The afterburn of holding steady through a conversation designed to destabilize me. He had made his first move, and I had met it. I lay back down, and this time I slept. The next 3 days moved with a strange double quality, slow in some hours, startlingly fast in others, like the time after a death when ordinary minutes feel both stretched and compressed. Diane Holloway was sharp and prepared and moved with the particular efficiency of a woman who had managed cases like mine before and did not find them abstract. We met in person on Saturday morning, and she walked me through the legal terrain in plain language without softening and without alarm. He will almost certainly plead down initially, she said. His attorney is known for that approach, plead the emotional circumstances, the alcohol dependency position, it as a single incident from an otherwise upstanding member of the community. She looked at me over her glasses. We are not going to let it be positioned that way. No, I said, we are not. The documentation you have is exceptional. 3 years of dated entries corroborated by medical records and an independent witness log from your neighbor, Mrs. Carver. Correct? Yes. I'd like to speak with her directly. I'll arrange it. I went to see Patricia Carver on Saturday afternoon. She answered the door before I knocked. She had seen me coming up her front walk. I later understood she always saw most of what happened on our street, had for years. And she looked at my face and pressed her hand to her mouth and said, "Oh, honey, I have been praying for this day." She was 71 years old, and she had the strongest handshake I had ever felt on a woman her age. And when I sat down in her living room and told her what was happening, she went to her hall closet without a word and came back with a green spiral notebook that was fat with use and handed it to me like she had been waiting to hand it to someone for a very long time. 4 years. She had been keeping that notebook for 4 years. The first time I heard it, she said, sitting across from me with her hands folded in her lap, I called it in. The officer who came was polite. He said there was nothing he could do without a formal complaint, but he was kind. He gave me a number to call if it happened again. She paused. It happened again. I kept calling. I kept writing it down because my sister, she was in a situation years ago, and there was never any evidence, and so I promised myself that if I ever saw it happening to someone else, I would be the evidence. Her eyes were steady on mine. You deserve better than what you got in that house, Emily. You always did. I left her house with the green notebook under my arm and the specific, terrible, grateful weight of being truly seen by another person. That evening, Marcus found me sitting at the dining table with the notebook and my own journal, and Diane's paperwork spread around me, working through the chronology. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me. You look different, he said. I looked up. Different how? He thought about it. Like yourself, he said finally. Like who I think you were before I was born, maybe. Before all of it. He leaned in the doorway. Grandma talks about the way you used to be. She always says you were fearless when you were young. I felt something turn over in my chest. My mother in Savannah, who had been calling me every day since she heard the news, who had said almost nothing directly but whose presence on the phone was like a hand held over a long distance. My mother, who had taught me to make biscuits and set a table, and believed that how you treat people at your table is a reflection of your soul. I said. I'm going to be again. Marcus nodded. Like that was all he needed to hear. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. In those 6 weeks, I did things I had not done in years. I called my mother and asked her to come stay with me, and she arrived on a Tuesday with 2 suitcases and a box of preserves, and did not say a single "I told you so," which cost her something I knew, and which I appreciated more than I could say. I started therapy with a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, who had an office downtown, and who in our first session said nothing for a long time after I finished talking, and then said, "Emily, what would you say to the version of yourself who is still on that bathroom floor?" And I thought about it seriously for a moment, and I said, I would tell her that the thing she's most afraid of is the only thing that will save her. Dr. Okafor wrote something down and said, "We are going to do good work together." I went to Margaret Walsh's support group on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after the breakfast. There were 11 women in the room, different ages, different backgrounds, different amounts of time out from their situations. Some of them were still in it, still in the middle of it, still calculating and managing and surviving. I sat in that circle, and I listened and I talked, and at one point, a woman named Roberta, who was 63 years old and had left her husband 8 months ago, started crying not from grief but from something that looked like recognition, and she said to me directly, "How did you know when you were ready? How did you know it was finally time?" The room went quiet. Everyone was looking at me. I thought about it honestly. I thought about the bathroom floor and the 47 tiles and the particular quality of that night's silence, and I thought about what had been different about it versus all the other nights. I think, I said slowly, that I finally ran out of story. All the stories I had been telling myself, that it would get better, that he would change, that I was managing it, that it wasn't as bad as it looked, they all just stopped working at the same time, in the same moment. I paused. When the story runs out, you have to face what's actually there. And what was actually there was my own face in a mirror, and I recognized myself, and that was enough. Roberta wiped her eyes. Several other women were nodding. Margaret Walsh was looking at me with an expression I would only fully understand later, the expression of someone watching a person step fully into something they were always meant to be. I drove home from that meeting on a clear, cold Thursday night, and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside, just sitting in the quiet dark of my own car in the driveway of my own house, and I breathed. My phone buzzed, a text from Lisa. It read, "Diane called me. Daniel's attorney made a second offer. He's not contesting the documented incidents. He's asking for a deal." I stared at the text for a moment. Then I typed back, "What did Diane say?" Lisa's response came in under 10 seconds. She said the documented pattern means the DA has leverage for a stronger position. She said to let her work. I set the phone on the seat and looked out through the windshield at my house, my front door, the porch light I had left on. The rooster clock was still inside on the kitchen wall, and I thought, tomorrow I'm taking that clock down. Not dramatically, not as a statement. Just because I never liked it, and I don't have to keep things I never liked anymore. A small thing, a completely inconsequential thing. And yet, I thought about all the small things I had stopped wanting over 18 years. The coffee the way I liked it, the chair at the head of the table, the clock on the wall. The version of myself that spoke in her own voice without calculating first whether the sound of it would make someone else angry. All those small things. They were what he had really taken, not the big things, not my safety or my autonomy, though he had taken those too. It was the accumulation of small surrenders, the 10,000 tiny abandonments of my own preferences and comforts and instincts that had made me unrecognizable to myself. I was going to take them back, one at a time. Starting with the clock, I went inside. My mother was asleep in the guest room. Marcus's shoes were by the door he was staying through the weekend. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they contain sleeping people who love you, which is a completely different kind of quiet than the silence I had lived in before. The silence that was really the held breath of anticipation. The waiting to see what mood walked through the door. The constant low-frequency monitoring that had been my life for so long I had mistaken it for normal. This quiet was soft. This quiet was safe. I got a glass of water. I stood at the kitchen counter in the dark, and I thought about the woman who had sat on a bathroom floor 36 hours ago and decided she was finished being finished, and I thought about how much had moved, how much had shifted, how many invisible hands had reached toward her across years and distances, and I thought about how it was not over. The hearing was still coming, the story was still in motion, Daniel was still Daniel, and the world was still complicated, and there were still days ahead that were going to be hard in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. But I was going into them as myself. That was different. That changed everything. I set down my glass. I reached up and took the rooster clock off the wall. I put it in the cabinet under the sink behind the cleaning supplies where I wouldn't have to look at it. Then I stood back and looked at the empty space on the wall where it had hung for 14 years, and I felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who has started finally and without apology to rearrange her own life. The hearing was on a Tuesday. I remember that detail specifically because Tuesdays had always been my least favorite day of the week, not dramatic enough to be Monday, not close enough to the weekend to carry any hope. Just a flat middle day that asked nothing of you and offered nothing back. It seemed fitting that the legal reckoning of my marriage would happen on a Tuesday. Unremarkable on the outside, everything on the inside. Diane Holloway picked me up at 8:15. She was in a charcoal blazer and carrying a briefcase that looked like it had been through 30 courtrooms and came out ahead every time, and she looked at me when I got in the car and said simply, "How are you?" "Steady," I said. And I was. Genuinely, surprisingly steady. "Good," she said. "Stay steady. Today is going to test that." She was not wrong. Daniel was already in the courtroom when we arrived. I had not seen him since the morning they put him in the patrol car 6 weeks earlier. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind, and with Dr. Okafor the moment of seeing him again, because I knew it was coming, and I knew it would carry weight regardless of how resolved I felt. You don't share a life with someone for 18 years, even a damaged, frightening life, without their presence in a room landing on you with physical force. He was thinner. That was the first thing I noticed. 6 weeks, and he was visibly thinner, the particular thinness of a man who had lost the infrastructure of his daily life and didn't know how to feed himself without it. He was wearing a gray suit. I recognized the one he wore to weddings and funerals, and his attorney, a compact man in his 50s named Gerald Fitch, was speaking quietly into his ear. Daniel looked up when I came in. I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. I did not look away first. Then I turned and walked to our table and sat down next to Diane and opened the folder in front of me and did not look at him again. Lisa was in the gallery, off-duty, out of uniform, but sitting with the particular stillness of a detective who is tracking everything in a room. My mother was beside her, 74 years old and upright as a church column, wearing her good coat and a look on her face that I recognized from my childhood as the look she wore when someone had done wrong to her family and was about to find out what that cost. Marcus was on my mother's other side. He had driven up from Athens the night before and slept on my couch and eaten toast with me at 6 a.m. without speaking, the two of us just present with each other in the kitchen, quiet. And that had been enough. Better than enough. The proceedings began, and I want to tell you something about courtrooms that television gets wrong. They are not dramatic in the way you expect. They are procedural and slow and full of language that sounds deliberately designed to drain the life out of everything it describes. What Daniel had done to me over 18 years was translated into legal terminology and case numbers and documentation references, and there is something profoundly strange about hearing the story of your survival read back to you in the flat voice of a court record. But the evidence was there, all of it. Diane had organized it with the precision of someone building something meant to stand for a long time. Gerald Fitch rose to present Daniel's response. He was smooth experience, the kind of attorney who understood that the goal was not to win an argument, but to create enough doubt to shift the terrain. He acknowledged documented incidents he had, to the evidence left him no choice, but he framed them within Daniel's alcohol dependency, his otherwise exemplary community, standing the absence of any prior criminal record, his expressed remorse, and voluntary enrollment in a rehabilitation program. Then Gerald Fitch said the thing that I had been told to prepare for, but that landed on me like a physical blow anyway. We would also submit. He said, his voice measured and sympathetic, that Mrs. Thompson's delayed reporting her choice over the course of nearly 2 decades, not to seek intervention, reflects a complex marital dynamic rather than a clear pattern of unilateral aggression. We are not disputing that harm occurred. We are asking the court to consider the full context. I felt Diane's hand touch my arm under the table, a light, deliberate touch. Stay steady. My jaw was tight. I breathed through my nose. He was using my survival against me, my silence, my management, my 18 years of protecting the life I had built, even as it was destroying me. He was presenting all of that as evidence that it hadn't been so bad. That if it had really been as bad as I said, wouldn't I have left sooner? I had known this was coming. Doctor. Okafor and I had talked about it directly. We had sat in her office and she had said, "When they say this in that courtroom, what are you going to feel?" And I had said, "Rage." And she had said, "Yes, feel the rage. Then let it pass through you, because the rage is not useful in that room. What is useful is what you already have, the truth." I felt the rage. I let it move through me like a current. And then I looked at Diane, and she was already on her feet. "Your Honor," Diane said, "the prosecution would like to respond to the characterization of Mrs. Thompson's choices during the documented period of abuse." She paused. "We would submit that the decision to delay reporting is not evidence of ambiguity. It is in fact a well-documented survival response that this court has seen in case after case, the result of calculated risk management, by a victim who had reason to believe that premature action would be more dangerous than continued endurance." She looked at Gerald Fitch steadily. Asking why she didn't leave sooner is the wrong question. The right question is why he kept making it impossible for her to leave safely, and the documented evidence answers that question clearly. The room was quiet. I exhaled. The judge, a woman in her late 60s named the Honorable Carol Reeves, who had the expression of someone who had heard every version of every story and retained the ability to be affected by none of them unless they earned it, looked at Diane's submission, then at Gerald Fitch, then at the documents in front of her for a long moment. Then she said, "I'd like to hear from Mrs. Thompson directly." I had not been told this would happen. Diane had said it was possible but unlikely at this stage. I turned to look at her and she gave me a single small nod that meant, "You have this. Go." I stood up. I walked to the front of the room and I stood where I was directed to stand, and I looked at Judge Reeves and she looked at me and she said, "Mrs. Thompson, in your own words, I would like you to tell me what you need this court to understand that is not in the documentation." I had not prepared for this question. I had prepared for the formal statements, the corroborating evidence, the procedural sequence. I had not prepared to be asked what I needed the court to understand beyond the paperwork. I stood there for a moment in the silence of that courtroom, and I thought about the bathroom floor, and the 47 tiles, and the rooster clock I had put in the cabinet under the sink. I thought about Patricia Carver's green notebook. I thought about the doctor I barely remembered who had held a file open for 3 years on my behalf. I thought about Marcus at 9 years old standing at the bottom of the stairs, and Marcus at 19 eating toast with me at 6 in the morning without needing to say anything. I thought about Lisa answering on the second ring. I thought about my mother's hands in mine over biscuit dough 25 years ago saying, "Be gentle, but committed." And then I spoke. "What I need you to understand," I said, "is that I never stopped fighting. I know it didn't look like fighting. From the outside, I know it looked like endurance at best and complicity at worst. But every day that I got up and made a plan and protected my son and preserved the evidence and stayed connected to the people who loved me, every single one of those days was a form of resistance. The silence was not surrender. The silence was strategy." I paused. "And I need you to understand that the morning I finally acted, it was not a moment of desperation. It was not a breakdown. It was the opposite. It was 18 years of planning arriving at the only morning it could have arrived. I was ready. I chose the moment. And I need that to be in the record. Judge Reeves looked at me for a long moment. She wrote something down. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson." I walked back to my seat. Diane squeezed my arm once hard without looking at me. Gerald Fitch made 2 more procedural arguments. The judge addressed them both efficiently without theater, and then she spoke, and what she said was not the maximum outcome Diane had outlined as possible, but it was consequential and binding, and it included mandatory conditions that would follow Daniel for years. The rehabilitation program, the restraining order formalized into a legal instrument, the record that now existed and could not be revised or charmed away. When the hearing concluded and the room began to move with the sound of people gathering papers and standing from their chairs, Daniel turned and looked at me from across the room for the second time that morning. He looked like a man who had finally, at 60 years old, run out of the thing that had kept him going, the certainty that he could manage any situation, talk his way through any corner, be forgiven any damage because he was Daniel Thompson and people liked Daniel Thompson. That certainty was gone. I could see its absence on his face the way you can see where a picture has been removed from a wall, the faint outline of what used to hang there. He opened his mouth. I turned away, not in anger, not in triumph, just done, finished. I had said what needed to be said in the place that mattered, and there was nothing left for me to receive from him, no version of an apology or a final word that would add to what I already had, and I simply did not need to receive it. I walked out of that courtroom with Diane on one side and Lisa on the other, and my mother coming up behind me with Marcus, and we stood together on the steps in the cold morning air, and nobody said anything for a full 30 seconds. Then my mother put her hand on my face, the side that had been bruised, now healed but remembered, and she looked at me and said, "Your grandmother would have been proud of you today." I covered her hand with mine and held it there against my cheek. "I hope so," I said. "I know so," she said. The months that followed were not a clean ascending line. I want to be honest about that, because if you are listening to this story from inside a situation like mine, you deserve the truth more than you deserve a tidy ending. There were days after the hearing that were harder than the hearing itself, days when the adrenaline of action had fully worn off, and what was left was the quiet, slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life from materials that had been damaged by long use. Days when I woke up at 3 a.m. out of old habit listening for footsteps, and had to remind myself that the sound I was hearing was just the house settling, just the world going on, just the ordinary noises of safety that I had not yet learned to trust. Dr. Okafor called that hypervigilance, and she said it would soften with time, and she was right, but time takes the time it takes, and there is no shortcut through it. I went to Margaret Walsh's group every Wednesday. I started going to church again, tentatively sitting in the back with Lisa, some Sundays letting Jerome's measured voice move through me without requiring anything of me I wasn't ready to give. I let my mother stay for 6 weeks longer than either of us had originally planned, and we made biscuits together on Sunday mornings, and did not talk about Daniel except when I needed to, and those conversations were brief and clear, and left us both feeling lighter rather than heavier, which was new. Marcus called every Sunday. The calls were longer now, real conversations, the kind where neither of us was managing the other, where we could say, "I'm struggling today," and have that be enough, have it not require fixing or explaining away. He started his own therapy in Athens. He called me the day after his first session and said, "Mom, I think I've been walking around with 100 pounds I didn't know I was carrying." And I said, "I know, baby." And he said, "How do you get it off?" And I said, "One session at a time, one day at a time. You just keep showing up." "That's your advice," he said. "Just keep showing up." "That's the whole thing," I said. "That's all of it." Patricia Carver and I had dinner together every other week now. She was sharp and funny and had opinions about everything, and had traveled more of the world than I had, and was teaching me slowly to play chess, which she was merciless about, and I was terrible at, and we both found enormously entertaining. She had testified at the hearing brief and devastating in her precision, and afterward she had said to me, I kept that notebook for you, but keeping it helped me too. It gave me something useful to do with the helplessness. I understood that better than I could say. 6 months after the hearing, Diane called me on a Thursday afternoon. "I have something to tell you," she said, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her before, something warm breaking through the professional surface. "Tell me," I said. "The rehabilitation program Daniel enrolled in. They have a restorative component. It's optional and entirely at your discretion, meaning you have zero obligation here. But Daniel's counselor reached out to me asking whether you would be open to a single written communication. Not a conversation, a letter. He's written one." A pause. "It's your call, Emily. 100% your call." I sat with that for a moment. The idea of a letter from Daniel 6 months out. I thought about who I had been the last time I received words from him, cringing, calculating, bracing for the weight of them. And I checked in with myself honestly to see if I was bracing now. I wasn't. "Send it," I said. The letter arrived the following week. It was 3 pages handwritten, and I sat at the dining table with my good china coffee mug to read it because that table was mine now and I used it how I chose. I read it once straight through and then sat with it for a while. It was not a perfect letter. It had moments that still leaned towards self-focus, the particular gravity of a person who is learning to see themselves clearly, but hasn't finished learning yet. But it named things, specifically clearly, without lawyerly softening. It named the hospital visit. It named the night Marcus was 9. It named the first time which he had spent 20 years framing differently in his own mind, and which he had apparently in 6 months of intensive work finally looked at directly. At the end, he wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't think I've earned the right to ask for it. What I want you to know is that I understand finally and without equivocation what I did and what it cost you. And I understand that the morning you set that table was not an act of revenge. It was an act of someone choosing herself after years of choosing fear. I am sorry it took me losing everything to see that clearly. You deserve to be seen clearly from the beginning." I folded the letter. I put it in the drawer, not in the journal, not in Diane's file, just in the kitchen drawer, where I kept things I wasn't ready to decide about yet. Maybe I would write back someday. Maybe I wouldn't. That was a decision for a future version of me, the version who had a little more distance and a little more wholeness, and I trusted her to make it when the time came. I poured myself another cup of coffee. I sat at the head of my table. Outside, the morning was doing whatever the morning does, carrying on, indifferent and generous at once, full of people in their own houses, making their own decisions, facing their own versions of the choice I had faced on a bathroom floor 7 months ago. Some of them would make the choice today. Some would not be ready for months, for years, maybe never. I understood all of those timelines now in a way I hadn't before because I had lived inside one, but I also knew the door was there. It was always there. And no one could open it for you, and no one could tell you when the moment was right, and the only thing you could do was hold on to the thread that led back to yourself through all the dark, and follow it when you were ready, and trust that something on the other side of the opening was worth the terror of the threshold. I was on the other side now. I was sitting at my own table drinking coffee the way I liked it, in a house that was quiet with safety, instead of silence with fear, with a son who called every Sunday, and a sister who had answered on the second ring, and a mother who drove 4 hours when I needed her, and a neighbor who kept a notebook, and a doctor who held a file, and a pastor who showed up, and a lawyer who had been waiting 2 years for my call. I had started over at 52 years old, and I want to say this plainly directly to anyone who is listening and recognizes this story from the inside: it is not too late. Not at 52, not at 60, not at whatever age you are sitting, wherever you are sitting right now. The morning you choose yourself is always, without exception, the right morning. I know because I have lived both sides of it. And the side I am on now, the side where the coffee is strong and the table is mine and the quiet is safe and the door opens from the inside, this side is worth every terrifying step it took to get here. I am Emily Thompson. I am 52 years old. I set a table that changed my life, and I am finally and completely and with no asterisk and no qualification free.